Do you believe in setting boundaries, even if it means losing people?
On the morning of my wedding, before the makeup artist even arrived, before I could take a deep breath and remind myself that this day was about joy and love, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I remember how my hands shook, not from nerves about walking down the aisle, but from the sight of the name flashing on the screen. Dad. A name I had not seen lit up on my phone in years, a name I had once dialed until my fingers cramped, begging for a response, only to be met with silence. His message was short, almost innocent, as though those years of silence and exile had been nothing more than a temporary misunderstanding. "We're here. We just want to talk." I sat there in my white robe, the veil still folded on the chair, and I felt the past slam into the room like a storm that had been waiting just beyond the walls. I knew instantly that this day, which was supposed to be mine, would not unfold without the shadow of the old wound stretching itself across every vow, every photo, every laugh. It feels strange now, remembering the exact moment when the life I had imagined for myself was ripped away, and my family decided I wasn't worth standing beside. My sister Jessica was always the golden child, the one with the sweet smile and the carefully rehearsed charm that never cracked, at least not in front of our parents. She had a way of tilting her head, of saying things with just the right mix of sincerity and innocence, so that you almost believed her even when you knew she was lying. She had learned early on that if you cry at the right moment, if you lower your voice just enough, people will bend toward you without realizing they are being manipulated. When I was in my early 20s, trying to figure out who I was, bouncing between jobs that didn't pay well but at least kept me afloat, Jessica began to spin a story about me. It started with little digs, the kind that parents brush off at first. "She's always out late," she'd say, pretending it was worry. "Her friends look rough. I don't know what she's mixed up in." And then, when she noticed that Mom and Dad's faces tightened every time she said those things, she took it further. "She doesn't act like she has any shame anymore. She must be into something, selling things she shouldn't." The words shameless and drugs began to creep into conversations where I wasn't present, and when I walked into the room, the silence that greeted me was thick and suffocating, as if everyone had agreed not to tell me what had just been said. At first, I laughed it off. I told myself that no one would believe her, that my parents knew me better than that blood was stronger than gossip. But blood doesn't always win when jealousy is dripping like poison into every ear. Slowly, the things I said were doubted, the things I did were questioned, and every mistake I made, no matter how small, was treated as proof that Jessica's whispers had been true all along. If I came home tired, they assumed it was drugs. If I asked for help, they called it manipulation. If I tried to defend myself, they told me that guilty people always get loud. The day everything collapsed is carved into my memory with painful clarity. I walked into the house, planning to grab some clothes before a shift at the diner, and found my suitcase sitting by the door, already packed. My mother's eyes were red, not from crying for me, but from the anger of someone who believed she had been deceived. My father's voice was flat, almost rehearsed, as though he had practiced saying it in the mirror. "You can't stay here. Not while you're living the way you are." I laughed, thinking it had to be a mistake, a bad joke, but when I looked at Jessica standing just behind them, her lips pressed together in that fake expression of pity, I understood. She had won. They believed her. I tried to explain, my voice rising, my words desperate, but they looked at me as though I was already a stranger. That night, I sat in my car with the engine off, the cold creeping in, staring at the cracked ceiling fabric, as if the answer to why my own family would cut me off might be written there. I thought about all the times Jessica had played me like a fool, all the times I had ignored the sharp edges in her, because I wanted to believe we were sisters first. And I realized that if I stayed broken, if I spent my life begging them to see the truth, I'd never recover. So I told myself something that has lived with me ever since. I would let them go, but I would never let them forget. I would build a life they couldn't ignore, and every lie Jessica spun would one day turn into a rope around her own neck. On my wedding morning, years later, when Dad's message appeared like a ghost clawing its way back into my life, I knew this was the moment I had been preparing for since that night in the car. But back then, when I first drove away from the house I used to call home, I didn't know how long it would take. I didn't know how much I'd lose, or how much I'd have to fight just to prove I could stand on my own. All I knew as I pulled onto the highway and left everything behind was that they had shut the door on me. And I swore, with every mile, that one day I'd make them regret it. I learned very quickly that when your own family treats you like a cautionary tale whispered at barbecues and church potlucks, the world begins to fit you for a costume you never asked to wear. So those first months after they pushed me out were a churn of sofa cushions and borrowed rooms, the kind of restless sleeping where you wake up and have to remember which ceiling you are staring at, while tiny rumors with my name stitched into them drifted behind me like a smoke trail that somehow kept setting off alarms in places I hadn't even walked into yet. And I discovered that survival, when you do not have the luxury of being believed, is an unglamorous ritual made of budget coffee, bus schedules, blistered feet, and the stubborn refusal to internalize the contempt other people so generously hand you. I said yes to any job that did not make my stomach turn, and when the diner shifts stacked up like dominoes I took them, because the tips, however thin and awkward, at least meant I could buy groceries without wincing. I learned to listen more than I spoke, to keep my head down and my hands fast, to pour refills with a smile that felt like a bandage across a wound that would not close, and when the regulars would lean across the counter and ask in that too casual tone where my family lived or what church I went to, I redirected with jokes about burnt toast and the manager's obsession with spotless salt shakers, because the truth, my truth, felt like a fragile bird that would be killed by the first cold breath if I let it out. Every so often a familiar face from home drifted into my orbit, a neighbor who once borrowed sugar or an old classmate who remembered me as the girl who could write a paper in a night. And they would tilt their heads with that curious pity that is almost worse than open hatred, the kind that says you are already filed under lost cause no matter what comes out of your mouth. And I would watch them leave a folded bill and a rumor behind, as though both were charitable offerings, as though I should be grateful for the narrative they had chosen on my behalf. I kept working, and I kept not collapsing, and I told myself that persistence, if sustained with enough dignity, eventually becomes a kind of music other people cannot help but hear, even if it starts as a single stubborn note. Because I am my mother's daughter in one particular way, painfully thorough when something is broken, I began to catalog the moments when the story about me grew legs, tracing it back to Jessica's talent for crisis theater, the somber brow, the damp lash, the whisper voiced like a prayer request, and it struck me that her advantage had never been truth, only performance, so I decided that if she loved stages so much, I would make the stage light up at the precise moment her lines failed to make sense. I had heard through the grapevine that she had started a charity that delivered care packages to families in need, and I could almost hear her rehearse speech about community and accountability, with a photo backdrop of labeled boxes and bows. And, because I know how vanity works, I knew she would push that image everywhere without understanding that paper trails dislike glitter. I spent evenings on a borrowed laptop in a laundromat that smelled like warm cotton and detergent, combing through state registries and tax records, reading the tiny print most people scroll past, and what I found was not a smoking gun, but a comedy of laziness. A name chosen that matched another registered nonprofit in a neighboring state, a donation page that did not issue receipts with required language, and a photo gallery so meticulously curated that the same boxes appeared in different neighborhoods with only the angle changed. I archived everything, took screenshots, and, because I wanted the blade to turn with as little visible effort for me as possible, I fed the right questions to the right people. A youth pastor who loved bylaws and a retired accountant who treated compliance like a sixth sacrament, and then I stepped back and let curiosity do what it always does when it smells inconsistency, which is swell into outrage dressed as civic duty. The first sign that the fuse had caught was a flurry of comments under her triumphant post about a weekend drop, questions about registration numbers and receipts, requests for the annual report that did not exist. Polite but pointed queries from people who had once smiled at her with the devotion reserved for weather girls and prom queens, and I pictured her face tightening just enough to crack the gloss. Within days the board she had cobbled together from friends who liked brunch more than Meetings quietly dissolved, the page went temporarily offline for updates, and there were murmurs, safe, careful murmurs, about funds that could not be accounted for and packages that had somehow traveled very far without ever leaving the same garage. I did not send a message to my parents, and I did not crow to anyone from home, because victory, to feel like justice and not gossip, has to breathe in clean air. Instead, I bought a better pair of shoes for my shifts, I paid the electric bill on time, and I allowed myself one private moment in the bathroom at work where I looked in the mirror and told the woman staring back that she had just rewritten a paragraph of her life without ever touching a pen, and if that is not a small miracle, then perhaps miracles are simply smaller than the stage lights suggest. The diner that night was loud and sticky and absolutely ordinary, and for the first time in too long the ordinary felt like a room where I might actually live. Of course I knew Jessica would not fall quietly, because people who float on other people's belief do not surrender the cushions without clawing at the upholstery, and sure enough a week later an envelope appeared in my locker with no return address. A set of printed screenshots that looked like text messages between me and a name I did not recognize, full of cheap bravado about selling pills I had never seen. The timestamps staggered just enough to make an amateur effort at believability, and as I stood there listening to the clatter of plates and the buzzer calling out orders, I realized that my first clean hit had taught her nothing except that she needed a louder lie. I slid the envelope back under my apron, told the cook I'd run the next tray, and smiled in a way that made him step back, because if Jessica wanted theater, I was about to give her a performance with an ending she had not rehearsed, and by the time the curtain dropped, the crowd would not be looking at me when they started asking the hard questions. The envelope with those clumsy screenshots did not scare me so much as it clarified the rules of the game, because when someone is willing to forge your voice and dress it in cheap bravado, they have announced that truth will not be a participant unless invited by force. So I folded the pages along their crooked margins, slid them into a plastic sleeve like an exhibit, and made a decision that surprised even me, which was to stop explaining and start documenting, since explanations had gotten me exactly nowhere while documents had a way of staying calm when people refused to. I began by tracing the sources of Jessica's performance, not because I wanted to stare at her face more than I already had to, but because staging leaves fingerprints, and people who love applause rarely wear gloves. I searched the public parts of her social accounts for the charity drops and saved every image at full size, then ran those files through a simple metadata tool on the laundromat laptop, and there they were, the tiny stubborn facts that no caption can bless into silence, timestamps that insisted several weekends of service had in fact been choreographed in one long Saturday. Location tags that betrayed the same driveway reused as a dozen neighborhoods if you tilted the camera and changed the bow color. And a string of model numbers for those carefully labeled boxes that matched bulk listings from an online wholesaler, whose reviews I read like a detective grazing through witness statements. Because I knew the difference between a smoking gun and a chorus of small inconsistencies, I kept adding pieces until any reasonable person would at least pause. And the next strand came from a woman named Hallie who had designed Jessica's early flyers for a PDA fundraiser years back and now managed communications for the church's outreach committee. She was the kind of meticulous volunteer who keeps emails in drafts because she hates retyping, and when I asked her without venom, without theatrics, if she had ever received formal receipts or a legitimate EIN for the donations that flowed through Jessica's hands, she sighed in that particular way people do when their conscience has been nudging them for months. Then forwarded me a folder of templates with odd edits, including a receipt that used the wrong tax language and a logo file whose original layers revealed the charity's warehouse wall as the cinder block of Jessica's garage. Those details on their own were embarrassing, but combined with the metadata, they sang a fuller tune, and I decided to let the music reach the right ears by asking specific, public questions that did not accuse, but simply requested verification, which in church culture functions like pulling a fire alarm without naming the arsonist. On a Tuesday evening when budget decisions were on the agenda and attendance skewed toward people who liked accountability almost as much as coffee, I showed up at the open meeting with my hair pulled back and my notes printed in a neat stack. And I asked if the outreach report for the quarter could include the registration number for partner organizations, whether the board meeting minutes for Jessica's charity could be added to the website as transparency best practice, and whether the treasurer preferred to receive spreadsheets in one format over another when reconciling in-kind donations. And by the time I got to my fourth question, several heads had already turned toward the empty seat where Jessica usually perched with her smile lit to full wattage, because it is one thing to bask in praise and quite another to answer process questions with documents that refuse to blush. I did not need to say fraud or deception. I only had to be relentlessly specific, and within a week a kindly but firm email went out to donors asking them to hold off on contributions while the church reviewed partnerships for alignment and compliance, which in our town reads like a weather alert telling everyone to bring their plants inside. I did not celebrate with champagne or righteous speeches, because a win that loud would only confirm her narrative that I was vindictive and shameless, so I bought a rotisserie chicken from the grocery store, paid the month's rent early, and took a long shower in the apartment a coworker had sublet to me at a price that suggested she believed in quiet second chances. There, under the hiss of water, I rehearsed the gentler version of revenge I was beginning to love, the kind that removes props, until the actor standing there is forced to be herself in front of an audience that expected miracles and got invoices, and I wondered if maybe survival had taught me a language I should have learned earlier. A grammar of restraint that says you can break a lie by refusing to be its antagonist and choosing to be its archivist instead. Yet, even as the charity page mutated into a locked door with a sign about maintenance and the donors asked polite but pointed questions about reporting obligations, I knew Jessica would pivot to a story where she was the wounded helper, sabotaged by jealousy and mental instability, so I prepared for that inevitable chapter by following a thread that had hummed in my head for months. The suspicion that the most damaging thing she ever produced was not a fake charity, but the series of messages that had convinced our parents I was trading pills for cash. The clue did not come from a hacker's trove or some dramatic confession. It arrived folded into a mundane trial subscription for a phone app that spoofed numbers and timestamps, buried in a promotional inbox linked to an email handle Jessica had used in high school, the one with a flourish of her nickname that she thought made her sound breezy and young, and there in the welcome message was a reminder about exporting chat logs as images, with layout options that matched almost perfectly the screenshots she had mailed to my locker, down to the jagged speech bubble edges and font spacing. I stared at that screen on the laundromat laptop with my hands pressed flat to the table, not because I was surprised. Anyone who has been smeared for long enough stops being surprised, but because the path to my parents' hearts had been crossed by a coupon code and a try premium for 3 days banner. And I felt a grief so ridiculous and so deep that I had to laugh before I could breathe again. I printed the terms of service, I saved the email with its timestamp, and I pulled the metadata from my own locker screenshots until the pattern settled into a map any decent adult could follow. Then I wrapped the entire packet in a plain folder with no flourish at all and addressed it not to my parents, who would knee-jerk toward excuses, but to the church committee and the school board member who had platformed Jessica's fundraising speeches, because institutions that once amplified her voice needed to hear the echo of its source. When the calls began, measured, careful, apologetic in that institutional tone that never quite says the word sorry, my phone lit up like a switchboard, and I realized the narrative had tipped, not toward vindication exactly, but toward the neutral ground where people stop assuming a woman must be lying if she sounds angry. One conversation came from a deacon who could not bring himself to say my name without clearing his throat. Another from a donor who asked if I would be comfortable meeting privately so she could hear my side, and then, late one night while the diner's neon buzzed against my blinds, a voicemail from my mother floated into the room with that old tremor I used to recognize as love, asking carefully, formally, if I would consider sending whatever documentation I had to them so they could reassess, which landed in my chest like a lead coin because reassessment is not remorse and documentation is not a daughter. I sat in the half-dark with the phone in my hand and the folder on the table and understood that I had dragged the truth into the light, and it had blinked back at me without promising anything, and just as I started to decide whether to mail copies or let the silence teach them for a while longer, a new notification blinked on the screen from an unknown number tied to the wedding planning site. A terse automated message stating that 2 additional guests had accessed the link and updated the RSVP with a last name I had not typed in years, and before I could decide if the chill running down my spine was fear or fury, the phone buzzed again, and a second alert appeared. Not automated this time, just one line from a number labeled only as private, saying that a conversation was long overdue and that they hoped I would hear them out on a very important day soon. By the time the seating chart was taped to the wardrobe and the florist's assistant had backed out of the room with a bucket of peonies and the kind of smile people wear when they want to tiptoe away from a bride who might cry without warning, I had stopped pretending that the RSVP ping and the private message promising a conversation on a very important day were coincidences, because if there is one thing exile teaches you, it is that people who erode your life with whispers do not suddenly turn patient on the week you are due to walk down an aisle. So I sat on the low stool in my robe with bobby pins between my teeth, and I rewrote the border rules for the day in a way that felt both petty and deeply sane, beginning with the front door, because the front door is where stories either get admitted or turned around. I called the venue coordinator, a calm woman named Miriam who could have organized a moon landing without smudging her lipstick, and I asked her to put the check-in table closer to the entrance and to have the ushers hand out the wristbands we had ordered for the open bar only after guests scanned a simple little QR code printed on the welcome cards. A code that I had just finished connecting to a private page my friend Hallie built in one afternoon of caffeinated brilliance, a page that contained exactly 3 things: a timeline of the misinformation that had rotted my family from the inside, a gentle but unmistakable acknowledgement statement at the bottom that required a digital signature to proceed, and a short note about house rules for the wedding that read like good manners with a spine: no gossip at the tables, no phone recordings without permission, no surprise toasts unless you cleared them with the coordinator, and no attempts to sit in the front row unless your name was on a little square card with my handwriting on it. There was humor folded into the language, lines about keeping your drama on silent mode and saving the confessions for the altar you actually believe in, and, because I am not above a little wedding day theater when the audience has earned it, I asked Miriam to have a small sign at the door that said, "No whispering zone," which made her snort and say she had seen worse at corporate retreats, which calmed me more than tranquil music ever could. I told myself this was not a barricade so much as a filter, because anyone who had loved me through the rough years would scan and sign without blinking, while anyone arriving to rehearse an old accusation would have to look serenity in the face and decide if their taste for spectacle was worth a digital signature that could be printed and kept. And although I could hear my mother's future protest in the distance, the polite outrage about being treated like a problem guest, I reminded myself that I was not a courtroom and I was not the child they had trained to be grateful for scraps of belief. I was a grown woman writing my guest list with a spine and a little dark humor, and if that counted as revenge, then perhaps revenge, like cake, can be served lightly frosted and still be satisfying. Somewhere around the 3rd pass of the curling iron, my maid of honor made an offhand joke about confiscating microphones, and I laughed so hard my eyes watered, not because it was ridiculous, but because it was the exact kind of ridiculous that would have saved me years ago, a clean line in the sand that says you cannot speak into my life unless you can also sign your name to the truth you ignored. And I thought about how many families could be rescued by a check-in table backed by a little backbone and a better Wi-Fi plan. I kept moving through the rituals, the makeup brush against my cheek, the zipper whispering up the dress, the shoes that looked better than they felt, and under all of it there was a vibration that was not panic so much as readiness. The feeling you get before a big presentation when you know you own the material and the tough questions cannot knock you off your notes, because the notes are documented and the notes are yours. And as the photographer clicked around the room and my aunt fussed with the hem as though fabric could become a shield if you smoothed it enough, I opened the private page on my phone just to watch it breathe. The soft outline of the timeline, the neat checkbox next to I acknowledge that I repeated or believed statements that harmed the bride, the signature box waiting like a blank stage, and I felt a steadiness settle into my bones that tasted like water after a long run. I was not out to humiliate anyone, though a petty piece of me, the piece that remembers. Sleeping on sofas with my shoes still on, wanted to, but more than that I wanted the day to be mine without a history lesson delivered as a toast. And the plan seemed so modest and so pointed that I almost laughed again at the audacity of calling it revenge when it was really just me curating access like any sane host. When the first round of guests began to arrive and the text thread in the bridal suite lit up with photos of shoes and hats and cousins trying to outsmile one another, I felt that old ache in my ribs where family used to live. And for a moment I wondered if I had finally built a life so careful that nothing unexpected could get in, and whether that caution had cost me something softer than victory, because even justified boundaries sometimes feel like a wall with a view you paid for in. Loneliness. I did not have time to chase that thought to the end, because my phone buzzed with the kind of vibration you learn to recognize even with your eyes closed. And when I looked down, the screen carried only a short line from a contact that used to be the center of my compass, the same line that had made my stomach flip on the worst day, and now had the nerve to arrive dressed as kindness. "We're here. We just want to talk," and Miriam's assistant knocked lightly to say two unexpected guests had scanned the code but stopped at the signature box and were asking if the bride could make an exception, because family is family, and as I walked toward the stairwell with my dress gathered in my hands like a secret I had decided to tell, a cleaner notification popped up showing a completed signature from a third device using my parents' last name but a different first, and when I turned the corner I understood why the ushers had gone suddenly quiet, because standing just beyond the no whispering zone sign in a dress too pale for a wedding that was not hers, clutching a gift bag like a prop, was Jessica, smiling as if she had planned the timing herself. The sight of Jessica hovering at the threshold like a guest star waiting for her cue did not knock the breath from my lungs so much as rearrange it into something steadier and colder. Because in that moment I understood that her talent had never been truth or even timing, but the audacity to treat other people's milestones as her personal stage. And I also understood that I had one final obligation to myself on this day that was supposed to belong to love, which was to ensure that performance met a set of rules it could not bend without snapping in public, so I gathered the skirt of my dress, squared my shoulders against the banister that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old money, and walked toward the check-in table where Miriam had taken up a position that can only be described as kindly immovable, a posture familiar to anyone who has ever managed adults behaving like toddlers at gala prices. Jessica began her script immediately, the breathy apology, the suggestion that misunderstandings had gotten out of hand, the graceful tilt of the head toward the parking lot where, she implied, a parental reconciliation waited in a car with the engine idling like a stage whisper, and I listened without interrupting. Not because I intended to entertain it, but because interruptions feed performers, while silence hangs like an honest mirror in which they cannot help seeing the outline of their own hunger. I looked down at the screen on the table that displayed the scan log and signatures with the quiet indifference of a register tally, and there, exactly as the alert had suggested, were two attempts that stalled at the acknowledgement line, followed by a third signature completed under a first name that did not belong to either of my parents, but carried our shared last name with that smug certainty some people wear like a crest, and because my mouth has always been faster than my patience, I felt a bitter laugh trying to climb up my throat, yet I let it die there and asked politely, in a tone I had learned from managers who keep rowdy rooms civil, whether she preferred to add her name now or to wait until she had spoken with the officiant about the content of her surprise toast. A question so blandly administrative that I watched the muscles in her jaw shiver as she tried to decide whether she was being threatened or merely inconvenienced, which is, in my experience, a distinction narcissists find unbearable. She said the word family like a coded key. She stitched a tremor into the syllables like a seamstress rescuing a dress. She gestured toward the gift bag with the earnestness of a street magician. And I let her finish before I told Miriam to admit my parents only after both had signed the acknowledgement in their own names, without proxies or euphemisms, after which they could sit in the last row with the other late additions and watch the ceremony in the full bright light of the truth they had starved for years until it learned to feed itself. When she realized that her advanced team would not breach the threshold on privilege alone, Jessica pivoted to a new scene with that familiar professionalism that had once made adults write checks without reading receipts. And she leaned closer to murmur that if I insisted on humiliating our parents, there would be consequences, that stories have a way of growing new heads when you try to cut them down. That even tonight a few guests could be reminded of the versions they had once repeated if she were forced to defend herself as a dutiful daughter, and while the old me might have strangled on the implication, the present me simply nodded as if discussing linen rentals and said that I agreed completely about stories growing heads, which is why I had hired, not for spectacle but for documentation, a closed-door videographer whose entire job for the hour before the ceremony was to capture short, private messages in a quiet room near the coat check, a room where anyone who felt the urge to tell their version could step in, sit under good lighting, and speak into a camera with the calm assurance of posterity. After which they would be asked to sign a release acknowledging the truthfulness of their statement and their willingness to be contacted by counsel if needed, because as I had learned in the laundromat with my stack of screenshots, lies crave audience, but loathe affidavits. And there was a particular mercy in offering both. Miriam, who understood choreography better than any of us, guided Jessica to the little velvet rope that led toward the message room with the same gentle competence she would use on a tipsy uncle, and for a beat my sister actually moved as if she might go, perhaps calculating whether a well-lit confession could be shaped in post. Then something in her eyes hardened, a tiny winter, and she stepped back, pressing the gift bag into the crook of her elbow like a shield, saying that she would not be signing anything today because true family did not require paperwork, and as the word paperwork landed with the dull thud of a shovel hitting clay, I felt a strange peace uncoil behind my ribs. Because the revenge I had been building toward did not require her signature or even her presence, it simply required that the audience who had enabled her learn to love proof more than performance. I nodded to the usher, the same one who had held the no whispering zone sign an hour earlier with a mildly theatrical flourish, and asked him to escort her to the guest book table where Hallie had placed a second QR code that, when scanned, delivered not the timeline but a quiet page with a single sentence and a time-stamped link. If you have ever repeated a harmful claim about the bride, you may correct the record here, followed by a confession form that auto-emailed both the sender and the recipient. And as people began to drift toward it with the cautious curiosity of parishioners approaching a font, I watched a few familiar names type with trembling thumbs, and I understood that sometimes revenge is not a sword but a cool, clean ledger that refuses to forget. I did not see my parents enter, at least not at first, because the music had started and the air changed and my mind folded itself around the steps I had practiced, yet out of the corner of my eye. Somewhere between the aisle runner and the breath I took before the first vow, I caught a glimpse of my father standing just inside the doorway with his hands knit at his waist the way he does when he is trying to look smaller than his choices. And beside him my mother with a tissue already scalded by mascara, and behind them an usher pointing discreetly to the last row where 2 seats waited like late penance. I held my place. I said the words I had chosen with the man who had loved me without rumor. I heard the congregation exhale at the kiss. And when the applause lifted, I felt a pressure at the base of my skull that could have been grief or relief, or the body's quiet applause for surviving, and I understood that whatever happened after the cake and the photographs would not be tidy. At the reception, while the band tuned and the chatter rose and the QR confessions chimed like distant bells, I received a handwritten note slipped beneath my plate without ceremony. A few lines in my father's script that said they were ready to sign anything and to say anything if it meant speaking to me face to face, and below it, in my mother's smaller hand, a sentence about time not healing what pride refuses to treat. And I folded the paper and placed it beneath the fork as if setting a boundary could be as quiet as setting a table. I did not decide that night whether I would meet them, not because I wanted to punish them forever, but because I had finally learned that some doors open best when they do not announce themselves with trumpets. And as the last song began and my husband's hand found mine and the room blurred into a soft, human mess of laughter and light, I imagined a future where documentation and forgiveness could share a calendar without erasing the cost. A future in which I might one day sit across from two people and let them say the words they should have said years ago, after which I would either stand up and hug them or stand up and walk away with the sun on my back, and both endings felt possible in a way that made the night taste honest. On the way out, as guests scribbled their names in the book and a few tapped the confession link with the furtive relief of people finally setting down a stone, I passed the message room and saw the camera's red light blinking patiently like a heartbeat, waiting for whoever was brave enough to tell a version they could live with, and I realized that my revenge had landed exactly where I needed it to on the cowardice that once defined my story, and that the truth now belonged to a future I did not have to hurry. A future where the next buzz on my phone might carry either a clean beginning or another performance, and where I would be ready, at last, to choose which stage I wanted to walk onto.